I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Bobby Kahn, Chief of Staff for Governor Roy Barnes and Chair of the Georgia Democratic Party. Bobby, welcome.
Good to be here.
You've been involved in Georgia politics for many years, but before we get into that career, tell us a little bit about Bobby Kahn.
Well, I grew up in Savannah and have two brothers and a sister. My family has been in the wholesale dry goods business since my grandfather came over here. My grandparents came from Lithuania and Latvia, and we're typical Jewish merchants, and worked hard and built a business. And I grew up in that business. I worked in it a couple of summers. My brother ended up working in it. And I got very interested in politics growing up in Savannah. My dad was always interested, never involved, but always interested in politics. We, like many families across the country, we watched the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, either before or after dinner, and that's where we got our news. Had reminisced about that when Cronkite passed a few weeks ago, and we were just always talking about politics. And back then, the state was very Democratic, and that happened to be where I was. Although my dad was good at playing devil's advocate, so I got exposed to both sides. A lot of the people I went to school with were Republican. I went to a private school in Savannah Country Day, and I remember when Carter was running for president. I was a senior, and nobody was for him but me and one other person, and I got excited because there was a show of hands for who was for which candidate and stuff, and not everybody raised their hand for Ford or Reagan, and I thought there was hope, but then that hand went up for John Connally. So I grew up around a lot of Republicans, but talked a lot of politics. The first campaign I ever was involved in, I guess I was involved in some of Mayor Rusakis's campaigns, handing out stuff, leaflets and stuff, but Phyllis Kravich was running for state court, and she won and ultimately became a judge on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. But I got involved in that, and then I got involved in President Carter's campaign when I was a senior in high school, and have been involved ever since.
So after Savannah Country Day, you went off to college.
I went to Emory. I had debated in high school and debated at Emory, which was great training for research and argument skills and analytical skills. My record wasn't very good, but I learned a lot from it.
And then to law school.
And then I went to law school at the University of Georgia. While I was in law school, I met some folks from Representative Joe Frank Harris's campaign, and I ended up, while most people were doing summer clerkships and stuff in law school, I worked in Governor Harris's campaign. And as a matter of fact, I worked between the first and second year of law school, and the campaign was just starting. And then between the second and third year, I worked in Fulton County, and he wasn't supposed to win the nomination. And when he did, it was about time for me to go back to law school. And I said, I'm not going to, well, back then we did the hard part, so I'm going to stick around. So 2 days after classes started, I called the registrar and said, I'm going to come back in January. And he got all over me. He said, you need to tell us that earlier. So I worked in the campaign in the fall, and then Governor Harris got elected. When I got out of law school, I wanted to get involved in politics, but a lot of people told me that you need to spend a little time practicing law. And I didn't want to do it at the time, but I did. and I went to work for Jim Oxendine, who was in Gwinnett County, and it was general practice, and did a little bit of everything. Of course, Jim's son's now running for governor. He's the insurance commissioner.
As a Republican.
As a Republican.
One of those people who switched parties.
He picked the right time to, not that there's a right time to switch, but he picked, he switched in '94 and rode the wave, got elected insurance commissioner. So I did that for a couple of years, and while I was working for Jim, who's now a judge in Gwinnett, he's a senior judge, Governor Harris had appointed Robert Benham to the Court of Appeals, first African-American on the court, and they asked me to help him, Governor Harris, and Judge Benham asked me to help with the campaign. So I ran that campaign.
That was your first real
first campaign I had run. I mean, I'd been involved in campaigns. I thought I knew everything. You will never know everything. But that was a campaign where you dealt with lawyers, and
How do you go about running a state campaign for a judge?
It's very tough. It's very tough. Especially, I mean, back then, I mean, African American running statewide, that was an unknown. He had the benefit of being an incumbent and having the establishment behind him, although having the establishment behind you in some years is not a good idea. But I mean, we set out to run a statewide campaign like any statewide campaign that's much bigger. And of course, there you end up,
Did he have opposition?
Certain things. He had, I believe, 3 people running against him. So our concern was a runoff. But we, Judge Benham enjoyed campaigning, and he liked going all over the state, hitting the Rotary clubs and stuff like that. And we raised money, which at the time was a fair amount. I believe it was $150,000. And did spend it on travel and radio, basically. And he won without a runoff.
You're best known as a political consultant, as a mentor and campaign manager for Roy Barnes. When did you meet Roy Barnes?
I met him in governor's race in 1982. And I was working Fulton, and obviously he was part of the leadership of the campaign, and did a lot in Cobb, and we did stuff to, Metro Atlanta stuff together. At that time, parts of Metro Atlanta, including Cobb and North Fulton, were rapidly going Republican. 1980 was a watershed year for the Republicans. I was in law school at the time, and I remember I went to the Carter Victory Party, and I'd been working in law school really hard, and I'd been looking forward to going to Atlanta to the Americana for the Victory Party for a couple of weeks, because I'd worked in the campaign before I went to law school. And so, I'd get in the car and drive on over here, and I walk into the hotel ballroom at like 5 after 7. And this was the first year of exit polls, and everything had been called. And back then, the networks had not adopted consistent red and blue. Yeah. So one station it was all red, and another station it was all blue. And when I thought red was Democrat, I thought, oh, it's looking good, but no, that's the wrong network. So, I'd walked in there at 7:05, and at 7:20, I got back in my car and rode back to Athens. I was in the law library at 9 o'clock. So, but that night, we thought Talmadge had won. So I'm walking to class the next morning, trying not to see all these Republicans I'd trash talked, and and I see a headline. It was a later edition of the paper that Mattingly had won. And he had won on the strength of, even though Carter had won the state, he got like 81% of the vote in Cobb County. And, of a very elevated turnout. So, you know, that was, so that's what we were dealing with in '82, was Republican areas and what was the suburbs, what is the suburbs. And happily those areas are coming back. But so in that campaign, you know, Roy had experience dealing with Republicans. He had always had opposition before that and really since. And so we were working on how to carve out Democratic votes in Republican areas.
Let me ask you this question. You don't have to answer it. Is it true that Roy Barnes was once a young Republican on the campus at the University of Georgia?
Yes. Yes.
Why do you think he switched over?
Well, you've talked to him. We both know politicians who change their mind from time to time.
Yes.
But he got into the that was the back then that was sort of the populist, rebellious group.
Young people.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, young people.
And I think it had a little bit to do with Governor Maddox, who was governor at the time. But he switched back to Democrat because that's where, you know, he thought
that's where his forefathers were.
Yeah, and you know, that's Democrats believe in not just looking out for a certain small group of people.
Early in your relationship, did you know that one day Roy Barnes might run for governor?
Well, you know, he's talking about running for the Senate in '86, but and he didn't. You know, he did that for a couple of weeks, and he didn't run. I didn't know him that well at the time. I knew him okay, but you know, after the '86 campaign, I had a good idea he was going to run for governor.
Well, let's talk about that first campaign in 1990 when he ran against a field, including Lieutenant Governor Zell Miller and former Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young.
Yes.
How did you look at that race?
Wrong. I had been executive director of the Democratic Party under the Harris administration. John Henry Anderson was chairman. And in some respects, Roy was considered the heir apparent to Governor Harris, and had a lot of the Harris people supporting him.
Let's stop there for a minute and point out that Georgia governors prior to Harris had been Busby, and they all came from the state legislature.
Yes.
And Roy was cut from that mold.
Mm-hmm.
He was in the state legislature for a number of years, and he was certainly knowledgeable in state government. Was that an asset in the race?
Yeah, we thought it would be. But he'd been in the state Senate for 16 years. He was elected in 1974. And, you know, he was looking to run a race just like Harris and Busby had. Well, you know, when you try to run last year's race, you're generally unsuccessful, and he was. There were a lot of reasons why 1990 wasn't like 1982 or 1974.
Right.
First of all, Roy came out of the Senate, not the House, which was important because the House had a candidate.
And the House had a very powerful organization.
Yeah.
Statewide.
And you know, while I'm not sure the House was enthusiastic about their candidate,
Right.
They were behind him.
Right.
And that was a place for them to park and not be for anybody else. So that's why 1990 was not like 1982 or 74. Secondly, Zell Miller, you know, knew what he wanted to do in a campaign for governor, and he knew what he wanted to do as governor. He had a great campaign, he had a great organization, and it was well funded.
And a great issue.
And a great issue. He had several good issues.
The lottery.
The lottery, but you know, I mean, believe me, I saw those ads over and over again. The lottery, boot camps for for first offenders and cracking down on health insurance companies. Mm-hmm. So, it was a good campaign, well done. And then there was another thing in the race, and that was former Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young was running, and he was very popular. He just finished his term as mayor. We had not gotten the Olympics at that point, but there was talk about it, and he was well known all over the world. And he was making a pitch in rural Georgia, which ultimately didn't work, but. He was an interesting, good candidate. So there was no room for Roy, mm-hmm. And Roy exceeded everybody's expectations, but our own. And he came in a strong third.
Yeah. How did he take that defeat?
It was all right. He had the biggest problem was he had loaned the campaign money, and the next day he wrote a check to pay it off.
Well, if I were him, I would take it pretty hard.
Yeah, the handwriting was on the wall. I mean, we knew it was uphill, and we knew 2 weeks before that, and we made some resource decisions on that basis, but we knew the room just wasn't there. Mm-hmm. Now, he got like 21% of the vote. He ended up exceeding what our last poll showed he was going to get, because a lot of the undecideds ended up breaking for him. Mm-hmm. But he knew it was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So,
what happened then?
Well, there was a runoff between Lieutenant Governor Miller and Mayor Young, and most of the state went for Zell Miller. Mm-hmm. I had a commitment and a friendship with Andy Young that went back really to the 1988 convention. While I was director of the party, we had pursued the Democratic Convention, mm-hmm. and we got it. Atlanta hosted the 1988 Democratic Convention, and I ended up being named president of Atlanta 88, which was a host organization, which did the parties but also managed the budget of the city's commitments. And these conventions, they'll go in and they'll extract commitments out of cities. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it was the city and the state. So we had this organization called Atlanta 88, which was chaired by Mayor Young, but on the board was Governor Harris, the Fulton County Commission Chairman Michael Lomax, the head of the chamber here, Bob Holder, and John Henry Anderson, the chair of the party. So those were my bosses. Mm-hmm. But Andy Young was the chairman, and I dealt with him a lot. And one of the most difficult things I ever did was Andy had been talking to me about running his campaign. Mm-hmm. And it was one Saturday afternoon in March of 1989, I went out to see him at his house to tell him I was going to work for Roy. And we had a great relationship, and he was great as chair, and the convention was a success. And so I was talking to him. Actually, it was a Sunday. I was supposed to go out on a Saturday, and I stayed up all night. I was just nervous and I couldn't sleep or anything. So I called him up to confirm. He said, I had something come up. Can we do this tomorrow? So I went through the same thing over again the next night. So I went out there Sunday afternoon, and it's the most difficult things I ever did, because he's a very nice person. I mean, he's a hero. And I said, I'm going to work for Roy Barnes. And he said, well, I don't really know Roy, but I've heard good things about him. But if Roy doesn't make it, will you be for me? And I said, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So the runoff, the primary election happens. A lot of people had made that commitment to Andy. Mm-hmm. But they expected him to finish first going into the runoff. Mm-hmm. As it happened, Lieutenant Governor finished first, and a strong first. Mm-hmm. And it was obvious he was going to be the nominee. Mm-hmm. He had the money, he had the momentum, he had the issues, mm-hmm. and he was going to be the nominee. But, Andy called me up Said he ran a good race. Y'all come help me. I said, I'll be there tomorrow.
Did that cause any hard feelings with Miller?
I believe it did. I believe it did, and that's too bad. But you know, Keith Mason and I were in law school together, and the day before the runoff, the young people said, "Well, why don't you fly around the state with Andy?" And my wife wasn't too wild about me getting in small planes, and today I'm not wild about getting in small planes, but back then I said, that'd be great. And a little side note, we're flying, you know, this was right before the Olympic decision, and it was right after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and one of Mayor Young's really good friends, who was on the Olympic committee, had been killed in the invasion, and he was talking about that. And then a reporter asked him about the Olympics, and he said, "Yeah, I think we got a good shot at getting the Olympics." And I'm thinking to myself, "Yeah, and you think you're going to win tomorrow?" So, what I was going to tell you was, it turned out we were, you know, when you do these fly arounds, you run into candidates all the time. And we were in Augusta, and we'd run into, we had landed just as Miller had taken off, and Keith was on the plane, and Keith called a mutual friend. I said, "You're not going to believe what's going on. Kahn just got off the plane with Andy. I can't believe he's doing that." So yeah, there were hard feelings.
But you're over them now.
Over them now. The interesting thing was, right after the election, that's when I got into what ultimately became what I do now. And we had figured out after the campaign that TV stations were overcharging. They were ripping off candidates. The FCC had done an audit and showed that there were overcharges. So I got with Roy, and then we got with some other people, Matt Towery and some Republicans, and started, you know, prepared to go after the stations. We waited till after the election, but we put a demand on all the stations in Georgia, and our clients included Zell Miller. So, you know, TV brought us together, and we recovered a fair amount of money. You know, he had spent the most, so we recovered a lot of money for the Miller campaign, and we ended up doing this all over the country. And I shifted from the litigation, because I learned so much about it. I shifted from the litigation side to the media buying side, because I knew what the stations were doing.
Are you still doing that?
Yeah. I started in an agency. I sold it when I went into the governor's office, but I returned when I was no longer in the governor's office. When I thought I always would, but I didn't think I'd return quite as early as I did.
Yeah.
The voters had other things in mind.
Yeah.
But, you know, Governor Miller and I had talked some in the '98 campaign, because he was helping Roy, and I went to a shoot with him, and, you know, it was a little, you know, we had some banter. And then when Roy appointed him to the Senate, when Paul Coverdale died, when Roy appointed Governor Miller to the Senate, then I worked with him closely. And you know, we obviously got along well then.
Tell us about that decision.
It was, you know, I mean, everybody's shocked when Paul Coverdale died, and he and Roy were friends from when they served in the Senate together. And, you know, they were both, you know, urban, suburban legislators. They were, you know, kind of reform-minded and worked on stuff together. So they were friends. But his death was a shock. And so Roy sat there with an appointment that he never expected to have. And he, that was, he thought about it and thought, that Governor Miller had the best chance of holding the seat.
Yeah, and an election was coming up.
Election was coming up, and it'd be a special in 2000. And so he appointed him. He flew up to Young Harris and met with him, and 2 days later he appointed him.
I need to ask this question. What was his and your reaction to Miller's performance as a United States Senator?
Well, I'll speak for myself. You talked to Roy. But that was when our relationship soured again. Because, he put Senator Cleveland in some difficult positions. But, we knew he was independent and of his own mind, and that was fine. He voted the way I think he thought he should vote. Where it became difficult for us was after '02, and he started really basically voting Republican. Siding with the Republicans and thumbing his nose and sticking his finger in the eyes of the Democrats. And it just so happened that at this time I became chairman of the party. And I had a job to do, and he had a job to do, and it didn't exactly fit. Now, I was under a lot of pressure from people in the party who were very upset with Senator Miller. And they wanted to kick him out of the party and have these resolutions against him and all that kind of stuff. And my position was, you can't kick him out of the party. I mean, there's nothing to kick. He doesn't have a membership card, and we don't want to really stir this up because, as it happens, a lot of people agree with him. So, a lot of people, we're trying to get votes. So the best thing to do is lay low. Well, there were party activists and people who had been friends and supporters of Roy and Zell who wanted something done. So it was left to me to criticize him. I didn't go out of my way to do it, but he gave that speech at the Republican convention, and I had to say something.
Yeah.
And I did, and he didn't like it. I remember he wrote this editorial, or he wrote this letter about the deacons of disaster. This was in the '04 campaign. He was talking about me, Ben Jones, and President Carter. So the deacons of disaster, Cooter, Kahn, and Carter. And, we had to do something, and we did. Now, one of the things we did was we took his clips from the '92 campaign when he was getting up there at the Democratic convention, gave a great speech, one of the great speeches of his career, I think.
Hear this voice.
Yeah, it was a great speech. And, he bashed President Bush 41. It was a populist speech. It was anti-Republican. And we put clips of that on the internet, and we put some of them on cable television. And I don't think he liked that. You would know.
It's hard to tell. Hard to tell.
Oh, I don't think so.
Well, Bobby, let's get back, if you will, for a minute to that period between 1990 and 1998 when you and Roy Barnes were vacationing. What happened during that period before he ran in 1998?
Well, he ran for the House. He'd been in the Senate, and he ran for the House in 1992, and he won. He ran from Mableton, basically, and it was just a piece of the Senate district. And it was his home area. And he won. He won rather handily. And he goes to, for the caucus meeting, or at some time he talked to Speaker Murphy. And the speaker said, well, what committees do you want to be on? And Roy says, he said, oh, I don't want to be on committees. I'll do everything from the floor. And the speaker said, that's what I'm afraid of, no. And so he ended up serving natural place for him was Judiciary Committee.
Right, yeah.
And that's an important committee, obviously, in the House, but there, a lot of good people on that committee, and they're very serious. They take themselves very seriously. And of course, Roy had been chairman of Judiciary in the Senate. He had been co-chair of the Constitutional Revision Committee, and he was serving with Denmark Gruber in '92, I guess. And so they sort of were the elder statesmen and the people who wrote a lot of the things in the bills that some people understood, but most people didn't.
What was your relationship with him during that period?
Well, that was when I was doing the TV litigation.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And
so you were in constant?
I was in his law office.
Oh, yeah.
And he was on the cases with us, and he argued. We had several appellate decisions. Appellate arguments, and he made them, or he participated in them. And I would talk to him about the cases because a lot of it was negotiation, and we had some overall issues about where we were going to pursue this in court or at the FCC. So I had a case. There were lawyers in the firms. They would joke, "How's your case?" I had one case, but we represented 50 people, and we had 100 stations we were pursuing, and so I practiced law out of his office between basically '91 and '98, and I ran, or I don't know, I guess I ran his legislative races. I was treasurer. Yeah. Of his legislative races and helped him raise the money, and we would do the mail and the phones and stuff. And in '96, he decided he was going to run for governor. But he couldn't announce before he qualified for re-election. And it looked like he was going to not have opposition. Because the Cobb Party, the Republicans had always qualified somebody. But they were focusing on other seats, and this seat really wasn't one they could take. But at the last minute, he ended up with opposition. So he had to run a race, and he couldn't start running for governor. But during the fall of '96, we were preparing for his campaign. And shortly after the election, he was telling people he was going to run. Maybe even a little before the election, he was telling people he was going to run, thinking that if he were getting out there, that Lieutenant Governor Howard would not. But Pierre went ahead and got out there probably in late October, early November. So he was running, Pierre was running, and Roy started raising money after the '96 election. And raised a couple $100,000, as did Pierre, going into '97. And during the '97 session, the big fear was Mike Bowers. He was.
Had he switched parties?
He switched before the '94 election.
Right.
His timing was good too. And so before the going into the '97 session, Mike Bowers was this, reformer, attorney general, white knight, all that sort of stuff. And there was a lot of concern in the legislature, among the Democrats in the legislature, House and Senate, that Roy and Pierre were going to kill themselves. They were going to get in a bitter fight and all that. So a lot of leadership talk to Roy about running for lieutenant governor, or talk to talk to both of them about not having a nasty primary. And so toward the end of the session, Roy and Pierre talked, and Roy decided he was going to run for lieutenant governor, and Pierre was going to run for governor. Obviously, there wouldn't be a ticket, but Roy would engender a fair amount of goodwill by stepping back and avoiding a bloody primary. Roy and Pierre did some things that some later candidates might have observed, but
what?
Avoiding a bloody primary. Oh. I'm thinking back to the '06 primary.
Well, I want to get to that, but not at this time.
So anyway, so Roy's off and running for lieutenant governor in April of '97, and he's raising money, and at that point we were going to have to, this is still Georgia law, but we were going to have to go through some steps to convert the money raised for governor to lieutenant governor, and we had not done that yet. We were just focused on getting new pledges in. And so in August, Roy's in Florida. And I know what it was. Roy and I had gone to a sheriff's meeting up at Chateau Elan. And then we were going to go over to Blairsville to a Howard fundraiser. And this was before GPS and really before MapQuest. And my sense of direction isn't very good. And but we basically had to cross mountains, so we were a little late. But so we went to Blairsville, and I saw Pierre there and talked to him. I said, "Hey, I got a business. I'd like to do your buy." He said, "Well, let's get together." So we set a time, and I called him, and I was going to go by and see him on, I think it was a Friday, and I was going to see him that afternoon. And that morning, I'm getting calls. Pierre called me and said, "I may want to talk to Roy, but can we move our meeting from 3 to 4?" I said, "Sure." And so, I start getting calls right after I talked to Pierre that he's going to drop out. I said, "No way, I just talked to him." And so then the calls kept coming, and finally I called Roy. I said, "I don't believe this is the case, but boy, the grapevine is really on fire." And then we got confirmation of it. And I called up somebody who worked for Pierre at the time. I said, "I take it we're not meeting this afternoon." And so the whole thing was a mystery, particularly in light of, Pierre had a great fundraiser. It was a great event, a people event and a money event in Blairsville. And that may have been a Tuesday or Wednesday, and this was a Friday. I may have the days wrong, but so the whole thing was a mystery.
So there was no arrangement between the two.
You mean for him to get out and Roy to get back? No, it was a surprise. There was, Pierre invited Roy to this fundraiser because, obviously they were friends. They'd been friends since they were part of the Gang of Five. In the Senate that did all this reform stuff.
Tell me what you remember about the Gang of Five.
Well, I kicking myself for bringing this up because every time I look it up, I talk about it, I have to go look it up. But they were doing reform stuff on like campaign finance and consumer issues and things like that. And as far as I remember, Roy was one. Ed Hine was one. Pierre Howard was one. Paul Trulock was one.
And you're missing the Undertaker.
Sutton?
No. The mayor, the present day mayor of Carrollton.
Oh, that's right, Wayne Garner. Wayne Garner.
Wayne Garner.
Yeah.
The Gang of Five.
That's right, and that was Roy and Zell had a on and off friendship. When they got there, they both got there in '75 from the '74 election, and they were both reformers. And there's a lot of, Busby there's some really pro-consumer stuff that was done in the mid-'70s that you could never get done today. Governor's Office of Consumer Affairs, which probably has been gutted. There was some really good landlord-tenant stuff for the tenant in there, and there were some other things. I guess the Consumer Utility Council, and so that, I think Roy and Zell were allies on that. But then Roy became Joe Frank's floor leader, and Zell was coming off of the Senate race, and so they were kind of in different places, and so and there was natural tension there. But I think the Gang of Five stuff probably bothered the lieutenant governor at the time.
Yeah.
But that's what I remember about it.
Well, Howard withdrew. Roy became the leading candidate, but he got some opposition from the Howard camp.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Roy, we talked the night, the day that Pierre dropped out. Pretty well figured this was you need to move fast. And Burt Lance talked to me, and he was, this is Roy's chance. He's got to take it. And so he came back the next day. He was going to come back a few days later. Imagine that, Roy Barnes cutting a vacation short. So he came back, and he announced he was going to run. And Lewis Massey, who was Secretary of State, had been appointed by Governor Miller to fill Max Cleland's unexpired term, because Max had resigned to run for the Senate. And Lewis ran a good campaign in '96 and was popular. And he ran, and he got in the primary too, thinking he would inherit a lot of Howard's support. And he got some of it. But the goodwill that Roy had engendered within, a lot of the people that were pushing Roy to run for lieutenant governor and not have a fight were friends with both Roy and Pierre. And they immediately came to Roy. And the time was right. I mean, that was an election about experience. And it was a little early for Lewis to be running for governor. And Roy ran on his record. And this was happening around the country. Gray Davis in California was up against two very well-financed challengers in the primary, and he ran on experience, and he won the primary he wasn't supposed to. So that was a good year.
Lewis did a very gracious thing, I thought, when he suspended his campaign.
Yes.
And that obviously helped the Barnes
oh, absolutely.
effort.
Roy had gotten like 49% of the vote. Lewis was second. And, these things take time. And so after a couple of days, he decided he didn't want to continue. And so Lewis and Roy and Governor Miller had a press conference in Governor Miller's office. And it was a unity press conference. And that helped a lot. Saved
your campaign some money.
Saved campaign money. Didn't have to run a runoff. Although we were concerned about turnout, so we had to do a little bit of a runoff campaign, but it was mainly with the idea of everybody's pulling together, let's move toward the general election. And so obviously won the runoff, saved a lot of money, had a unified party going into the general election. They were supposed to have a runoff, but they didn't.
They didn't, that's right.
Roy had just come under 50%, Milner had gotten over 50%. And that provided a little sense of urgency about getting together. And of course, Milner had run, this was the third time for him. He had almost he came very close to beating Governor Miller. The Cleland race was close. And so, third time could have been the charm.
Were you afraid of him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, he had all the money in the world. He had learned, Canada loses, learns. And he had learned from his last two elections. One of the things he did, particularly in the '94 election, was, and a lot of self-funders do this, he thought he would do it on the cheap. And he ended up, at the end, dumping a bunch of money in that if he had spent it earlier, he could have spent it more wisely. But he wasn't going to make that mistake this time. So, you know, we knew that. And he started in on Roy immediately, just hammering him on television. Soft on crime, too liberal for Georgia. Soft on welfare, too liberal for Georgia.
Sounds like Karl Rove.
Yeah. So, you know, it was a tough campaign.
But you won handily.
Yeah. To our great shock. The margin, that is.
Yeah. Yeah. That was surprising to some people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, but it was a good year for Democrats. It was a good year for Democrats nationally and here. And, you know.
So Roy Barnes becomes governor.
Mm-hmm.
And you move into the Capitol.
I wasn't planning on doing that either.
Really?
No, I enjoyed my business, and I'd never been in government before. But, you know, it seemed like a good thing to do.
A lot of responsibility.
Yes. Yes.
I'm going to ask you this question. Again, you don't have to answer, but you were known as a tough guy in the Barnes administration. Are you a tough guy?
Well, you know, I have this reputation, but when people meet me, they tell me I'm not so bad. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I had a constituency of 1. And, you know, I guess some people had to say no. And Roy wasn't too good at that. So, and then that's, you know, that I think you go back to every chief of staff, executive secretary. You know, the governor's job is to say yes, and your job is to say no. And you know, Roy knew what he was doing as governor, and he knew state government. He knew the legislature. I think one thing that nobody appreciates until they get there is just how big government is and how entrenched the bureaucracy is. You know, I mean, you know, the department heads will come over and, oh yeah, we'll do that, whatever you want, and then, you know, getting it done within the bureaucracy is a whole nother matter. And so, but you know, Roy had a very ambitious agenda, legislative agenda, and was very successful in getting it passed. And there were some tough votes, and you know.
Let's talk about some of his accomplishments. What do you think was his greatest accomplishment?
I think overall it was his vision when it came to transportation and infrastructure issues like water. But you know, globally it's that sort of thing, and having a handle on what the state needs to do to educate its kids, grow, and that sort of thing. Now we had a lot of issues within that. I think his management of the budget was really good, really good in retrospect.
Yes.
But I mean, we had a lot of issues within that. The first year we did transportation, also did health care, doctor choice, and you know, those were some contentious things. Transportation, not so, because there were, compared to health care, because for health care there were lobbyists. For transportation, there was no organized group saying we don't want to do that. Now, there became one. But, so the first year we did that.
That was the Northern Arc.
That came up later, yeah. And that was part of an overall transportation plan. And that actually came in 2001. And it was part of an integrated transportation plan that included light rail and buses and highways. The Northern Arc was one of them. And the Northern Arc was actually a compromise. It was a piece of the outer perimeter. I mean, there had been plans on the books at DOT to build a perimeter around 285,
Mm-hmm.
probably since what, the 70s. And this was just connecting 75 to 85 north of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that became, for people living in the path and people that didn't want to spend money on it because it was expensive,
Mm-hmm.
a great rallying cry. So
then there's 2002, re-election.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that.
Well, we need to talk about 2 sessions of the legislature before.
Good.
You're the interviewer, but
That's good.
2000 we did education reform, and that became very controversial. Obviously, it was a comprehensive education reform that Roy's been studying education. He was on Governor Harris's Education Reform Commission, and he knew these issues pretty well. And he puts his own commission together. And 2 of the models they were looking at were North Carolina, and Roy's good friends with Governor Hunt, former Governor Hunt, and they've done a lot to improve education over there. And the other one was Texas, with Governor Bush, and he had pulled a lot of their reforms from North Carolina. And then Governor Bush used the Texas and mainly Texas, because that's what he was familiar with, for No Child Left Behind. So this was in the era of testing and accountability and that sort of thing. And one of the big problems with No Child Left Behind was it wasn't funded. But a lot of the concepts were in there. We're in No Child Left Behind and the Georgia Governor Barnes education reform. The one that gets all the attention is doing away with teacher tenure. And there was a bad tactical decision made there, and I will tell it. I will go through it with you. Roy wanted to do something about, fair dismissal, and basically, getting like another year or 2 of probation. I don't know all the terms. I'm not that familiar with the whole education reform effort, other than helping to get it passed. But he wanted to get a couple more years of probation before they fell under the Fair Dismissal Act or tenure. And we talked to the leaders in the teacher organization, GAE Page and all that, and said, what can we do on this? And they came back and said nothing. So we said, well, we're going to have a fight on our hands. Let's go for something that is really big. We never thought we'd get passed. And but Roy was good at getting stuff passed, and that became the focus of the bill, and it was only a small part of it, and it was a mistake to do it. And that became the rallying cry. The interesting thing was, a lot of what we were doing, including getting rid of tenure, were Republican ideas. And when the bill was introduced in the House, there were a couple hundred changes made to it, and most of those changes were offered up by Republicans. The Republicans came to Roy and said, we want to work with you on this, and we're going to have this little committee. They had Earl Earhart and Brooks Coleman and 2 or 3 other people on it. They made most of the changes that went into the House version of the bill. By the time it hit the Senate, there was just a storm because of, tenure, and then, there were other things. Superintendents saw that they were going to lose control over the expenditure of money and that sort of thing. And so the Republicans lined up, including Senator Perdue and Senator Eric Johnson, and they fought it. And we passed it in the Senate, but there were some senators and some House members who lost because of their vote on education reform. And then, it just became an easy thing to talk about and the rallying cry. And, we were feeling pretty good about our ability to pass stuff, so we went ahead and passed it, and we probably should. Well, we shouldn't have, because it's not the focus of education reform, and it just gave everybody a rallying cry.
Changing the flag also became an issue.
The flag, not something that Roy wanted to get into, because he knew it would dominate. But the problem was it was dominating everything. It was part of every discussion. Mm-hmm. But even then, he didn't want to necessarily get into it. He thought if he made a move at passing it, he had one shot in his term, or even terms as governor. If he failed, it'd be another 10 years before he could look at it. But we were getting pressure from all kinds of places. The biggest came from the NCAA. Mm. They were scheduled to have, I think, the Final Four and a bunch of ACC and SEC tournaments in 2003, 4, and 5. Mm-hmm. And I think there was one. Yeah, there was one recently. Those were all on the table. In fact, the NCAA moved something out of South Carolina recently because of their flag controversy. But we were getting a lot of pressure. And then we were getting pressure from legislators, African American and suburban Democrats, white Democrats who were feeling it from their constituents. So this would have been in 2001. We had basically ridden it out until, I'm talking about in 2000. We'd ridden it out in the first year, but it kept coming back, and it would come up in context of legislative initiatives. So it wasn't going away, and it was going to become a part of everything we did. But even then, we were in, it was December of 2000. And if you'd asked me December 1st if he was going to do anything, I would have said no. Then we had a meeting of the legislative leadership. And this was the Democrats. This was pretty well rural dominated. But a lot of them had big African American constituencies. Mm-hmm. And they said, started talking about, we need to do something. Of course, a legislator saying that and then wanting to do it is another thing. They'd been known to change their minds too. Now, Speaker Murphy said, y'all are crazy. And so we were talking it through, and the business community was putting a lot of pressure on us. So at that point, we had resurrected something that Cecil Alexander had done after Governor Miller tried to change the flag, and it was a field of blue with the seal, which was the original state flag, which would have been, or field of blue in the coat of arms, I guess, was the original state flag, which seemed like a pretty good flag. But then he had these flags of every flag that had flown over the United States, Great Britain, France, Spain, all that. And so then we started talking to some of the people that didn't want to change the flag, and said, well, what if we had on here some representation of the 56 flag? And they were open to it. And then, so we were playing around with a glue stick and cutting and pasting and stuff, and it was in early January, and Denmark Gruber came up for a judge's swearing in, and came in and talked to him. And at this point, we still didn't think we were going to do anything. This was January of 2001. We still didn't think we were going to do anything. And Denmark Gruber came in, and he was the author of or voted on the 56 flag. And he said, you need to change the flag. So Roy came back to my office and said, come in here and bring your folder. And I did, and showed him the various iterations and talked about it. And So then we, at this point, started talking among ourselves. And we had gotten a letter at this point from Eric Johnson, who was the Republican leader of the Senate. Or it wasn't a letter to us, it was a letter to his colleagues saying, don't take the bait. This was a Democrat problem. You know, they say Democrat. They made the flag in '56. You know, let them figure it out. We don't need to help. So, well, we're not going to get their help. So, but at one point, Eric sent word that he would, if we would work with them on reapportionment, they would help us on the flag. A deal we should have taken. But, you know, I mean, you know, given that, there was no way that you were going to get many Republicans to help. They were going to play this for every racial point they could. So, you know, here we are into the second week in January, and we start talking to legislators, leadership, but never let a copy of the thing out. And, you know, they were warming up to it. Never as a group. We would talk to them individually. And Roy was scheduled to speak in Milledgeville, like around the 21st, 22nd of January. And it was on the original Capitol, and it was a historic thing and all that sort of thing. So the legislature was going to be in recess like Monday and Tuesday. So we thought we would make a run at it. And so then we started getting together and putting a game plan together, and talked to Ed Holcomb, who was at Georgia Power at the time, and worked, you know, helping the chamber because his boss was head of the chamber, and the Atlanta chamber. And we had a meeting at the governor's mansion after the speech in Milledgeville. And at that point, Roy started calling senators, like Senate leadership, because we were going to do this in the House. Pretty much had the House leadership at least sort of there.
Including the Speaker?
Roy had gone up to see him like maybe Friday of the previous week. I don't know, let me talk to my boys, and you know, of course we had already talked to his boys. And so, you know, they were, this was when the test was coming, the people that said, you know, our people want to do something, you know, whether they would follow through. Mm-hmm. And they were looking for a leader, and he was it. Mm-hmm. So we made the move. And we knew that we had one shot at it. So that was the whole thing about the doing it quickly.
Yeah, how did doing it quickly really happen? The public was not aware of that.
No. And, well, there was a bill, and it needed to get changed in House rules. And the House Rules chairman was Calvin Smyrie, and we'd been talking to him for months. Mm-hmm. So we were going to change it in House Rules, and they were going to vote it onto the floor, which is unusual, but they did. They did. And listen, the press right when it happened was pretty good. Mm-hmm. You know, it was a masterful stroke. You had the Republicans complaining about it, but the people, by and large, you know, thought we needed, you know, the ones that the press talked to thought we needed to change the flag. Mm-hmm. But then the protests started. We figured if you had the protests and everything beforehand, there's no way you were going to pass it. Mm-hmm. And we had one shot at it, and we wanted to get it out of the way. Mm-hmm. So.
And you did.
As a legislative matter. And, you know, the idea was we voted it in the Senate, the House on Wednesday or Tuesday, and then get it in the Senate, because we didn't want them going home. But, you know, there were some, the Senate has tougher rules. So it was coming up, I guess, Monday or Tuesday after they came back. So they went home. and we worked the Senate over the weekend. And, you know, it barely passed the House, and it barely passed the Senate. And, you know, we had Republican votes both times. But, you know, there were legislators who lost because of it.
What was your relationship with the group known now as the Flaggers? Did they have any input?
Actually, we had talked to them before, some of them beforehand. I don't know all of them, but there are people that I know within those groups. And we had talked to them beforehand, and they said, well, we don't like it, but having that on there, the 56 flag on there, is better than not having it on there. And they didn't like, you know, there was no way they were going to go for the pre-56 flag, which is basically the flag we have today, because it was considered a civil rights flag, which, ironically enough, it was the flag of the Confederacy, not the battle flag. So, yeah, we had talked to some of them, but listen, when the Republicans got hold of it in the Senate, and then the protest happened, it became the teacher thing, only a whole lot worse. It just a pounding. Then people started talking about how ugly the flag was. And listen, it was not a thing of beauty. It was a vehicle for change. As far as I was concerned, you know, and a lot of people were concerned, just the coat of arms or the seal on a field of blue would suffice. But, you know, he called it the Denny's placemat and all that sort of thing. So, you know, it became a rallying cry, another rallying cry. And both what was done and how it was done. But you could not have gone, it was a transition flag. You could not have gone from the 56 flag to the flag the pre-56 flag that had been the symbol of wanting to get rid of the 56 flag for 20 years. You couldn't have gone straight to that. So,
another thorny issue was reapportionment.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about that.
We should have taken Eric's deal. Reapportionment has never been a pretty process.
Now this was in what year?
It would have been 2001. It would have been after the flag thing. So things were not going well with Republicans as it was. And the history of reapportionment had always been incumbents taking care of themselves. It is a nasty, nasty game. And, you know, they had the constraints of the Voting Rights Act and Justice Department. And so both Democrats and Republicans would use that in whatever they did, but the number one goal was incumbents taking care of themselves. Well, our view was that's a good way to lose a lot more seats, because while one incumbent Democrat can win a seat, the next person, because it's done to his or her choosing, and you get this neighborhood and that neighborhood in there, when that person retires or in a bad year gets beat, like 94, then it's going to go Republican. So, you know, we, in the map drawing tools, it got a lot better. So we thought, yeah, I mean, politics had always driven it before, but we'd inject a little politics in it to the benefit of the Democrats. And, I mean, that angered Democrats and Republicans, because Democratic House members didn't want us sticking our nose in their business and taking away precincts that included their relatives. And so, you know, the party, which was the governor, was very active in doing what parties do, which is promote things in the interest of the party. And that included some maps that favored Democrats. And it offended legislators who wanted to draw their own maps, and it offended Republicans who saw what was going on to the detriment of Republicans. And, you know, it offended some people who look at maps and don't like splitting up counties and communities. And so that became another rallying cry. But again, I don't see. I mean, if you're going to do it and have if you're going to do it, you don't have politics in it, and that's where you have a commission, which some states do, and try to eliminate the politics from it. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to have politics in it, I don't see a whole lot of difference between drawing it partisan for a Democrat or drawing it partisan for an incumbent. Mm-hmm. Now, as it happened, Democrats in the legislature, I mean, our view was, you pack the Republicans together, but don't put them in with each other. Why anger them? Those are going to be Republican seats. Let them be incumbent Republican seats. But a lot of legislators wanted to stick it to the Republicans, so they put Republicans together, and that made things worse. So, but on the congressional map, even with the Republicans redoing it, we ended up picking up a seat. Mm-hmm.
So with all of that, the teachers, the flag, reapportionment, you move into
Northern Arc.
You move into re-election in 2002. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that race.
Well, you had September 11th of 2001, which just clobbered the economy, particularly the tourism business. And we had the dot-com bust, and Georgia had a lot of technology jobs. So, so the economy was down. And, we were cutting budgets. Turns out those were the glory days of the budget compared to what we got now. But, we went into that race. We knew there were problems, but we thought we were okay. The biggest problem was Roy never got, other than just what could have been anomalies, never really got above 50% in polling, in our own polling. Public polls, yeah. But in our own polling, we never got above 50%. We had tested all kinds of messages, and it really didn't move anybody. We tested negative messages, and people didn't care about negative stuff on Sonny Perdue. Mm-hmm. It was all about Roy. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it was a well-funded campaign, and we tried a lot of things, and we lost.
Are you surprised?
Yeah. I stayed in the governor's office until June. The campaign got up and running, and we're really late 01, but I think had an office in January of 02. And I did, I figured would be spending more time on politics. So after bill signing, I went over to the campaign. But it was, everywhere he was going, he was hitting flaggers and, hearing about things. I worked for Carter in 1980 between college and law school. And I went to Texas and Kentucky, and I went around with Charlie Graves, who had been the executive director of the party. And so I went places with him. And I learned there that, when you're running for re-election, you're spending a lot of time explaining stuff you did and apologizing. All these people that helped Carter in '76, they couldn't get calls returned and stuff like that. And so, I mean, it wasn't all these people, but there were enough anecdotes that it was a problem. So re-election is about the incumbent, and we gave a lot to the Republicans to run on, and it wasn't a good Democratic year. I was surprised. I thought even though we didn't get above 50, I thought that people would stay home, or that we'd have enough undecideds break our way. Mm-hmm. But we did a good job of turning out African American vote. I mean, it was at a record level that year for a non-presidential year, and it was very strong for us. Mm-hmm. We did an even better job of turning out white Republicans.
Do you think it's historically noteworthy that the Republican candidates in 2002 were former Democrats?
Well, I mean, getting too inflammatory here. The base of the Republican Party is former Democrats who switched over race. I mean, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and said we lost the South for a generation, that's the Republican Party. Now, it's included a lot of the old-style Republicans, and it's included, you know, they've gotten new, younger people, but the base of the Republican Party is people who switched in '64. So no. In fact, the ironic thing about Eric Johnson's letter that we shouldn't help because it was Democrats who did it. Well, the Democrats who did it, a lot of those folks became Republicans.
Well, it's 2009. We sit here on the campus of the University of Georgia. There's a gubernatorial election next year. Roy Barnes is a candidate. What do you think? Will he be successful?
I think so, but I've thought that before. I mean, he has I think the first person I ever heard say this was Zell Miller after the 1980 race, that you learn a whole lot more when you lose than when you win. Now, you know, learning gets old after a while, but he learned a lot. He learned a lot in 1990 from Zell Miller. He learned a lot in 2002 from himself and from the people. And he's taken those lessons and applying them.
Do you think these 8 years have been long enough for people to forget those issues that hampered him during his race in 2002?
Oh, they'll be reminded of them. But, you know, I think what a lot of people want to know is whether he learned from those issues, what he says about those issues, and what he wants to do in the future. Now, I mean, the state has a lot of problems. The country has a lot of problems. And in some respects, it's like '98, that, you know, people may be looking for experience. But, you know, you don't run the last race or even the race before that, although you do take lessons from it. But, you know, it's a better time to have a conversation about those issues.
You think he'll be the same progressive and forceful governor he was during his term?
I think he'll be I think he'll be more patient, and he'll pick his issues. It's going to be tough it's a different world with the Republican legislature, and in some respects that may make him a better governor because he won't be able to get his way on everything.
Well, Bobby, you served as chair of the Georgia Democratic Party. Let's talk about that for a minute. What happened to the Democratic Party in Georgia?
Well, coming out of the ashes of 2002, it was tough times, still is. I was interested in being chair because I wanted to help with a coordinated message for '06. And I think we did that. Not to success, but I mean, we put the issues out there. We had our problems. '04 was a tough year in Georgia because of the presidential campaign and, you know, Zell validated a lot of independents who may have voted Democratic before, swing voters, but Zell validated them being Republicans. And they agreed with him. You know, I mean, he is a very persuasive communicator and made the case for George Bush very well. Now, Bush would have won Georgia anyway, but, you know, a lot of the issues Zell talked about resonated. I mean, he reached people very well. But '04, you know, we were up against a very popular candidate for the Senate, and our candidate was underfunded and not as strong. So '04 was a tough year. The maps had been redone either by the legislature or by the courts, you know, activist judges. So we didn't really have any hope there. So we were already thinking toward 2006 and the governor's race and the other races. But we had a very, very bitter primary. The candidates did not get back together afterwards. And even if they had, I don't think it would have mattered. I think it would have helped down ballot. I think it would have helped with Mark Taylor's margin, but I don't think he could have beat Perdue that year in retrospect. I mean, it's taken me a while to come to this conclusion, but Sonny Perdue is a very good candidate.
Well,
I mean, he reached people well too.
The Democrats also in '06 lost an opportunity to replace the two candidates for governor, Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah. I mean, but that, we were focused on the governor's race, there's no question about it. And, when that, and we had primaries for Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State too. And those candidates were left broke. They didn't start out with much, but they were left broke. And so it was tough. It was tough down the ballot. But, demographics are favoring us. I think Republican performance is favoring us. Don't know if it's happening quick enough for 2010, but, a lot will depend on what's going on globally and, nationally with the Democratic Party and with the president. But I think with a strong top of the ticket, that we can pick up some of the hold or pick up some of those other constitutional offices.
Some disenchanted Democrats think that the state party is too aligned with minorities and labor unions and liberals. Is that a good assessment?
The party, no. I mean, I understand that reputation, but it's whoever wants to get involved, really. And one of the tough things, and it's something I've attempted to do with varying degrees of success since I was executive director of the party, is get elected officials, legislators involved. And, they'll do some stuff, but, you gotta really push them. And, I think the key to a strong party, and a lot of the constituency groups don't agree with me on this, but the key to a strong party is involvement of elected officials, of, minority, business, every form and fashion of elected officials, and that's a diverse group here.
Do you think the national party has an impact on elections in Georgia?
It's all according to the election. Certainly in 1994 it did, in a negative way. In 1998, I think it had an effect in a positive way. By national party, I mean, we're talking the Democratic National Committee, but also the, what's going on in Congress, what's going on with the president. And yeah, heretofore, if an election was nationalized, it wasn't good, by and large, for Georgia. The '08 election was nationalized, and, our people did better because of the turnout model. So I think we're better off, though, when it's local candidates running on local issues.
How long do you think it would take Georgia Democrats to regain power in the state?
You're going to have to go through another, you got the governor's race, and that would certainly go a long way toward building the party, is having a Democrat as governor. One of the chambers could go back after reapportionment, because what's happened is the suburban areas are have got, you know, the Mattingly story from 1980. Mm-hmm. You know, those areas are going Democratic. Cobb was 45% Democratic this last election, and it was like 38% the previous. And Gwinnett's the same way. So those areas are going Democratic, and we'll pick up legislative seats there. Whether in 2010 by beating, that's where some of our pickups came this last election, or 2010 by knocking off incumbents, or just by reapportionment. Now, they moved out. The Republicans have moved out. I mean, this is something y'all probably have looked at, but if you took a look at families that lived at the stadium area, Turner Field area in the 40s, you know, they first moved to DeKalb, and then to Northwest Atlanta, and then to Gwinnett and Cobb, and then to Forsyth and Cherokee and Bartow. And so as they move out, that's where the Republicans are the ones that move out. So, but the suburban areas should be Democratic. The other thing is a lot of the people you lose in rural Georgia, where reapportionment where the legislature endeavors to protect itself in reapportionment, and this is something where we had fights. You know, rural Georgia's losing population, so it becomes tougher and tougher to protect those people. Well, the people in need of protection now are Republicans. We've lost the seats down there that we're going to lose, and we can start gaining some back. So it's conceivable with a, you know, with a map under the new rules, that we could start picking seats back up, 2014, 2016.
Let's talk for a minute about the quality of candidates. The Republicans claim that they do a better job of recruiting and training candidates. What is the Democratic Party doing about that?
Well, that is the toughest job that a party has. I mean, and it's not something you just decide in March. Well, we got qualifying coming up in April, and we need to recruit. I mean, that's a ongoing year-round deal. In the early days with Newt and Paul Coverdale, the Republicans picked their battles and they recruited candidates, and they did a pretty good job. At some point along the way, they recruited themselves. You know, I mean, it was just areas went from Democrat to Republican, and whoever was on the ballot, whatever warm body was on the ballot, won. We've got a few of those situations now. In fact, in this last election, there were 2 or 3 seats where if we had had a warm body on the ballot, the seats would be Democratic. And the party, I think, is focusing on the caucuses. A lot of recruiting goes on in the House and Senate caucus. They're looking at that now, and I mean, those are some of the seats they're focusing on. The training's gotten a lot better by both parties over the years, whether it's use of the voter file, door-to-door techniques, now digital and the internet. The training's gotten better by both parties. Recruiting's become tougher, you know. It takes more of a time commitment for people to serve. Elections are tough and expensive. So it's a challenge for both parties. The interesting thing about this the 06 election, I don't think a single incumbent lost in the general election. So Democrat or Republican. And the Republicans missed some recruiting opportunities there, as did we.
2010, if former Governor Barnes prevails, will you be a part of his administration?
No. I have kids in college, and I have a business. I will help him any way he wants, but it will be from the outside.
In other words, the famous Bobby Kahn will not be a factor in Roy Barnes' administration.
4 years in state government was enough for me.
Let me ask you a very personal question. you're well known throughout the state and the nation for your political activities. How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I'm not too wild about the tough guy thing, you know. I want to be remembered as a hard worker who served who he was working for. And, you know, I worked hard in the governor's office, but I think we were fair. I've had Republican legislators who tell me, I spent more time in your office than I do in the current governor's office. I got friends on both sides. Some would say more friends on the Republican side now, but I would like to be remembered as somebody who worked hard and who was fair.
So you think you don't deserve the comment that some writer said about you, that Bobby Kahn knows only two classes of people, Democrats and the rest of the world?
Well, that's not a bad way to look at the world, but like I said, there's one legislator who a Republican, who's just an absolute nutcase. I'm not going to say his name, but he was shocked because he came in to the governor's office and wanted an admiral in the Georgia Navy. I said, sure. And he went around telling people, I got the admiral in the Georgia Navy. I can't believe he did it. Well, he asked. He's a legislator.
Yeah.
Part of it is you just want him to ask.
Well, that's true. Well, Bobby, thank you so much for being with us. We've certainly enjoyed our conversation. And we'll give you a final opportunity to say anything you'd like to say about your career or your experience.
Well, I've been through, I've had some extraordinary opportunities, whether at the party, which was probably my favorite job, executive director of the party. I was young, energetic, and really loved politics. I still do, but that was my first real shot. But that and the convention, which I never thought I'd have an opportunity to be a part of. And then working with Governor Barnes and the administration and the things we did. I've enjoyed it. I like telling my kids about it. They enjoyed it. And doing stuff like this makes me remember it, and I've enjoyed doing that as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.